Thank you for this session. The speaker who I'm about to introduce will be looking at the recently published guide on safe and inclusive spaces in public libraries, providing practical guidance for dealing with challenging situations. Our speaker today is Yvonne Morris. She's the Projects and Programmes Manager at CILIP. A chartered librarian, she firmly believes that library information and knowledge workers are a force for positive change within society, organisations and communities. Yvonne has a strong interest in the development of professional policy in the library, information and cultural heritage sectors and in professional ethics. She recently managed the Arts Council England funded project to develop new guidance for the sector on managing controversial materials. Managing safe and inclusive public library services, which is the focus of this talk. Hopefully there'll be more time at the end for some questions. If not, you'll be able to contact Yvonne afterwards. Okay, thank you, Yvonne.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me up to Scotland to talk about this new guidance today. It's the first time I've ever been in Dundee, and it's really great to be here. So before I take you through the core principles and recommendations in the new guidelines, I want to provide some context on the project. So in 2022, CILIP was commissioned by Arts Council England to review and refresh, that was the original brief, review and refresh a document called The Management of Controversial Material in Public Libraries, that was published in 2008 by the Museums, Libraries and Archives Council. Some of you may be familiar with it. It was generally well received and it's been well used. But in 2022, it was 15 years old, and our ethical, legal and professional landscape has changed since then. So it was reviewed for currency and relevancy. And we found, unsurprisingly, a strong focus on the contemporary context, radicalisation, terrorism and prevent. They were the issues really making the headlines in 2008. And there have also been, of course, since 2008, significant changes to the legal landscape, most notably the introduction in 2010 of the Equality Act, which introduced the 9 protected characteristics and the public sector equality duty. And of course, there was no mention of that in the 2008 guidance. And our professional practice has moved on too in the last 15 years. Librarians and library staff are now able to draw on a significant body of knowledge and expertise when seeking to develop services that are broad, balanced and inclusive, whilst at the same time addressing the issues of systemic bias and prejudice. And we have social media now, of course, that's had a huge impact on all of our lives, good and bad. And right now, in the 2020s, library staff are working in a particularly challenging and polarised environment. We've seen a rise in challenges to decisions around stock, library activities and events, and the hiring of library spaces. In 2022, CILIP conducted a censorship survey, and we found that the majority of respondents said they were either very concerned or somewhat concerned about an increased incidence of challenges to stock, events and the use of library spaces. And a third of respondents to that survey said that they had themselves been asked to censor material. So too often, library staff are finding themselves faced with what must feel like at times an impossible choice between professional ethics and values on the one hand and their duty to the safety and welfare of their users. In an attempt to reconcile these conflicts, rather than a simple refresh of the 2008 guidance, we ended up pretty much completely rewriting it and giving it its new title, Managing Safe and Inclusive Public Library Services, a Practical Guide. The new guidance aligns the sector's ethical, legal and professional responsibilities with the practical decisions made every day by library staff. It draws on CILIP's ethical framework to present a decision-making framework to be applied in 4 contexts. They are the management of stock, public internet access, the use of public spaces, and library events and activities. And there's also a section on managing conflict. So who is this guidance aimed at? Who is it for? Well, primarily public librarians and library staff, responsible for making decisions, defining and implementing policies relating to stock, public internet access, use of space and public programming. It's also intended to provide guidance to library staff in schools and prison library services managed by public library authorities. And councillors or local authority managers are another audience. But because defending intellectual freedom is a core commitment of this profession, the key principles that I'll be taking you through in a moment apply across all contexts. So whilst this was written primarily for public library staff, it does have relevance across all sectors. So now for the disclaimer. It shouldn't be considered legal advice. We strongly advise public library authorities to speak to their legal teams when implementing the recommendations contained within it. So much has changed, as I said, since 2008. But one thing that hasn't changed is the core commitment of our profession to uphold, promote and defend intellectual freedom and to oppose censorship. This core commitment is affirmed in the new guidance, and I'll read this affirmation out in full as it's absolutely central to this work. Librarians and library staff have a core and ongoing commitment to freedom of expression and freedom of access to information. A library is not a place in which to hide from difficult ideas, but to equip our users with the critical literacy to engage productively with difficult ideas in their proper context. In this context, librarians have both an ongoing duty to oppose censorship in all its forms and a proactive duty to develop collections, activities and services which properly reflect and celebrate the diversity of lived experience and identities in the communities that we serve. These professional commitments are central to the trusted role that libraries hold in our society, and they should not be curtailed by any governing body or third party for any reason other than that they are expressly prescribed by law. In the guidance, alongside the statement that I've just read out, you'll find what we're calling the Statement of Professional Commitment to Intellectual Freedom, and that reinforces what I've just read out, what was on the last slide. It sets out why intellectual freedom is so important in a free and democratic society, why it's the core business of libraries, and also the role and responsibility of the librarian in defending it. We're encouraging governing bodies, funders and policymakers to support the statement, and you'll find it in the body of the guidance itself, and also you can download it as a separate document from the CILIP website. So turning now to the 11 key principles. So what does proactively opposing censorship on the one hand, whilst at the same time proactively developing services that reflect and celebrate diversity, actually look like in practice? Well, the overarching principle when approaching this work is don't be scared, but do be prepared, because this is challenging. And at times it can be frightening. It can be frightening to have protesters blocking the entrance to your library and interrupting your events, as has happened in the last couple of years with the Drag Queen Story events. We do recognise that, but by taking the time to reflect on the risks and develop appropriate policies in advance of any issues, libraries can ensure that they are well prepared and confident in their decision making. So from selecting stock to hiring out meeting rooms, there are a common set of 11 key principles to consider. Before taking you through them, it's important to stress that they're not intended to be hard and fast rules, and they should always be applied with judgment and appropriate reflection. So the first one is the importance of taking a risk management approach. An approach based on good risk management, planning and control is a good way to navigate these complex issues. Libraries should therefore consider reviewing, revising or updating their risk register to identify the risks associated with stock, public events, internet access and the use of public spaces. It's essential not to allow the actual or perceived risks associated with a particular activity to overwhelm the values of the library as a universally welcoming and inclusive space focused on intellectual freedom. In times of challenge or conflict, self-censorship or exaggerated risk controls, such as cancelling entire classes or activities or removing access to stock perceived to be risky, can be as damaging to the core purpose of the library as the conflict itself. The second principle is the importance of promoting the safety of library workers, because of course library workers have a right to work without fear of abuse, harassment or harm. So library leaders should always consider the emotional, psychological and physical safety and security of their staff as being paramount. So risk assessments should explicitly consider how staff will be supported in the event of a dispute, protest or other intervention. And where necessary and appropriate, library leaders should work with staff reps and unions to develop policies and procedures which allow the library to deliver a full range of services to the public whilst protecting the safety and welfare of staff and volunteers. So turning now to the law, and of course library services must be delivered within the context of the prevailing law. Now previously, in the 2008 guidance and before that, the simple form of this principle was that access to information should not be restricted on any grounds except that of the law. However, the reality is that this simple formulation isn't really sufficient to guide libraries in the practical interpretation of their legal responsibilities. For example, there remains a risk that even though a piece of material or an activity may not be prohibited by law, it falls into the category known as lawful but awful or legal but harmful. Books which include assertions that constitute Holocaust denial would be an example of this, because Holocaust denial isn't unlawful in the UK, but it does have the potential to cause very deep offence and harm to some in our community. Similarly, there may be circumstances in which the provision of access to information, events, activities or public spaces could bring the library into conflict with other statutory duties, including the Equality Act of 2010 and the public sector equality duty. So within the guidance, you'll find a revised version of this principle, which is access to information, events, activities or public spaces should not be prohibited unless prohibited by law. However, there may be circumstances in which the library may place conditions on access, but only were obliged to do so by their responsibilities to safeguarding, public safety, or their public duty under the Equality Act 2010 and related legislation. And there's some examples of the relevant legislation and regulations in the guidance. Although, of course, the law is constantly changing, and even though the guidance was published in September last year, it already predates Martin's Law, for example, that provides guidance on for publicly accessible venues on the steps they need to take to try to prevent terrorist attack. It predates the Online Safety Act and the Hate Crime and Public Order Scotland Act. So you really do need to keep abreast of the changing legal context. Turning now to ethics and values. We encourage library staff and decision makers to be mindful of the ethics that lie at the heart of all library and information services. And there's a link on the slide to CILIP's ethical framework. Those who are familiar with the ethical framework will know of the 7 ethical principles. The ones of particular relevance here are, number 1, the commitment to uphold, promote and defend human rights, equality and diversity, and the equitable treatment of users and colleagues. Number 4, the commitment to uphold, promote and defend intellectual freedom, including freedom from censorship. And also number 5, impartiality and the avoidance of inappropriate bias. And I'll come on to bias in a moment. So we encourage library staff to discuss what CILIP's ethical framework means to them, and within your teams to discuss what it means for your teams. And the same goes for your organisational values too, to think about the values that you want to shine through in your services to your users. When making decisions about the provision of library services, library staff and decision makers should ensure that their actions are both consistent with their stated organisational values and the requirements of professional ethics and the law. For example, it's common for library services to express corporate commitment to inclusivity and universal access. However, situations may arise from time to time whereby access to events, activities or public spaces could be refused to specific groups, where, for example, a group is prescribed by law or their presence in the library may result in an incitement of hate speech or violence. In these circumstances, it's important that the library staff and decision makers involved have reflected on the conditions under which their stated corporate values would be in contradiction with their legal responsibilities. It's also important to ensure that all members of library staff understand the values of the service and the circumstances under which access could be refused to specific groups or individuals, especially frontline staff, as it's often frontline staff who act as the first point of contact for such inquiries. So turning now to bias and the importance of reflecting on your biases. We used to talk about the library as being a neutral space without any or little real recognition of bias, whereas in reality we're all susceptible to bias, which comes from our background and our education and the circumstances of our lives. In addition to our personal biases, we must be aware of the systemic biases in our society, which are beneficial to some people whilst marginalising and disadvantaging others. It's the ethical responsibility of librarians and library staff to be actively conscious to these biases and to work to correct them through the design and delivery of inclusive and welcoming services. So instead of being neutral, librarians and library staff should be aware of their biases, accountable for them, and strive to mitigate the impact of their biases on their services. In practical terms, the best way to do that is to include more people in the development of your services. So more diversity of lived experience, more diversity of thought. Turning now to stakeholders. A positive and proactive approach to risk and crisis management between the library service and the local authority or governing body is often a decisive factor in the event of a public issue. So, engage with your local authority or your governing body to reach an agreed position on the management and provision of safe and inclusive services. These discussions should address the potential risks arising from the library's policies and programmes and the controls for these risks, including the support provided by the local authority. The circumstances under which activities would require a specific risk assessment, such as an event addressing a subject matter that's known to be controversial or potentially offensive. And any crisis communications or communications management plan in the event of complaints or challenges concerning your stock, your activities, or the use of your premises and facilities. And as part of that dialogue, it may be necessary to explain to your stakeholders the need for a broad and inclusive approach to your stock programming and use of your premises. Well, if it's risky, why do we just not bother going there? That would undermine the core values of the library. Yes, this is challenging, but we can't choose the simple way out, which is just don't engage with contentious issues. We have to engage, so let's be prepared. We found that stakeholder maps and engagement plans are very useful to help you to prepare. So if you don't already have these, it would be advisable to develop them. And also to develop appropriate policies. Because be prepared is absolutely the watchword for librarians and library staff. The times of greatest risk are those where library staff either need to make up decisions themselves or the library service is forced to establish its position after the problem has occurred or a challenge has been raised, so when they get caught on the hoof. So, develop policies and procedures and make them publicly available so everybody knows where they stand. Examples of these include your collection development or your stock policies, standards or rules for acceptable computer or Wi-Fi use, codes of conduct for your events, safeguarding or child safety policies, and library access policies. And remember to refer to them when key decisions are being made, including when procuring content or services from third parties, and use them in induction and training. This is challenging work, as I've said. Navigating the implications and risks of decisions about access to your information, your events, activities, your public spaces is a specialist role requiring specialist expertise. So we strongly recommend that library services revise their staff profiles to ensure the service has adequate access to professional skills, library skills and leadership. Your volunteers, casual or your non-specialist staff should not be left to establish the library's approach to policies without support from professional librarians. It's really important to ensure that decisions are made based on the best available evidence. This is particularly important at the moment whilst libraries are under so much scrutiny. So it's always valuable to reach out to your library network to solicit experiences, example policies, and methods for dealing with contentious issues so you can build up your own evidence base. It's really important to ensure that decision making is well documented so that the library service is able to evidence the approach taken and the rationale for specific choices. We found that where libraries have experienced challenges to decisions, the outcome has commonly been best where they were able to provide evidence of considered reflection and accountable decision making. And turning now to training, because at the end of the day, it doesn't matter how good or thoughtful or well evidenced your policies are if nobody's aware of them. So it's essential to ensure that staff are inducted, trained and periodically retrained in the library service's values, policies, practices and processes so that they can implement them with confidence. It's really important if you're frontline staff that you do know enough about the legal context and the library's policies so that you can either defend them if that's unavoidable or pass on any challenging feedback to a line manager. You may wish to consider a quick skills audit or pulse survey of your teams to ensure that they feel equipped to manage challenge and to make evidence-based decisions. As well as awareness raising and confidence building through training. Also consider how staff will be supported should any issues arise, particularly if they arise outside of core hours. And ask yourself, do staff know, do you know whom to approach for escalation, support or help in reaching a decision? And then finally, the importance of reflecting and learning from experience. So once you've dealt with a challenging situation, reflect on what worked well, what didn't work so well, and what you may wish to do differently should there be a next time. And you might want to create an action plan to act on any lessons learned. So, as I noted earlier at the outset, these principles don't constitute a hard and fast set of rules. The external environment has changed significantly since the publication of the 2008 MLA guidance, as has the legal context. So it's really important for librarians, library staff and decision makers to be alive to this changing context and to adjust their policies and practices accordingly. After all, what may be considered acceptable in one generation may not be in the next. It's recommended that library services review and reflect critically on their policies, practices, training, leadership and governance on a periodic basis, so about every 5 years, and agree any necessary adjustments to ensure that the provision of services continues to fulfil your legal and societal responsibilities. So, turning now to the practical application, this is part 2 of the guidelines, if you like. Now, I'm not going to take too much of a deep dive into this. I just want to give you a flavour of what it covers, an outline of what it covers. So if there's anything here that particularly is of interest to you, we think will be particularly useful, then you can take a look at the guidance itself. But I'll just take you through the 4 contexts. So the first one is the management of stock. A core consideration here a core consideration in all aspects of stock management in public libraries is the responsibility of the library to the local community, actively and positively to promote resources for learning, education, cultural inspiration and community cohesion. It's very important that all sectors of the community feel able to play a full part in community life and not feel intimidated, marginalised or ignored. The requirement to respond comprehensively and non-judgmentally to the needs of learners and researchers should be paramount. So elements considered in this chapter include collection development policies, as these provide a solid framework for balanced and informed decision making. We recommend all library authorities should have a publicly available and up-to-date collection development policy that responds to the demography and needs of the community and the library's role to promote information, ideas and the cultural experience. The section also covers stock selection, community engagement in collection development, supplier selection, because of course it's important to note that the principles I've just taken you through apply whoever is doing the selection. It covers presentation and promotion of stock, handling donations and also weeding. Then you come to the section on public internet access. And the core principle here is that access should be provided in accordance with the principles of freedom of thought and expression. This section looks at acceptable internet use policies and the need to proactively draw these policies to users' attention. It lays out some of the considerations when internet access is being mediated or filtered, including the need for transparency around the use of filtering technologies. And council policy regarding the provision of mediated or filtered internet access should ideally be developed with the library service in such a way that it's compatible with professional ethics and the values of the service. Then we come on to public spaces, the 3rd context considered in the guidance. Public libraries were designed with the aim of providing safe, trusted and universally inclusive physical spaces embedded in the heart of their communities. Although not every library is in reality regarded as universally inclusive by their communities, that should remain our ambition in keeping with our ethics. So elements to consider here include promoting your physical spaces, accessibility and inclusive design, location locale, dealing with protests and disruptions, whether they are occurring inside or outside the library, and there's a checklist included in the guidance to help you with that, and the basis on which individuals may be prevented from accessing the premises. And then finally, events and activities. Whether taking place physically or online, events and activities should reflect and reinforce the values and ethos which underpin the library itself. So elements considered here include programming, different types of events and activities, planning, promoting and evaluating your events. There's more on risk assessments and also consideration of safe spaces when you may wish to create a safe space. So that's the guidance. It's quite lengthy. It's 55 pages, I think, 56 pages long. But you'll be pleased to know there is a toolkit of supporting resources as well, including an executive summary, somewhat shorter, and also a number of checklists and things. So I'll just give you a flavour of what else is available. Now, we haven't provided template documents to accompany the guidance, since we felt it's important that libraries have the opportunity to consider and develop their own policies. But there are a number of checklists, including this 11 key principles checklist, to help you to think through the issues. And that's within the body of the guidance itself. It can also be downloaded as a discrete document as well. We've got a couple of posters. The first one is this public-facing poster, designed by Carl Millett, who was our illustrator we used at our recent Green Libraries conference. And the thinking behind this poster, really, it's a way of saying that, we librarians, we've got your back. On your behalf, because this is your library, we will oppose censorship and take steps to ensure that our collections and our events are diverse, that there's something for everyone, that you don't feel ignored. At the same time, it's a way of making explicit to people who are minded to complain, challenge, which of course they're entitled to do, but it's a way of making clear that the librarians have a duty to create collections that are diverse, to ensure that everyone is represented, and that we will take all reasonable steps to avoid censorship unless required by law. And there's also the staff-facing poster. The thinking behind this one is really to serve as a reminder to staff of that core ethical principle, defending intellectual freedom, opposing censorship, and what that means in practice. And it also serves as a reminder that the guidance is available. So it's freely available for you to download. It's there to help you. And there's a couple of checklists. One is dealing with protest. This is to help you, designed to help you if you think there's going to be likely to be a protest, help you to prepare in advance of the protest, how to deal with it when it's actually occurring, and what to do after the event. So it takes you through that. And there's a crisis comms template as well. That's been included because with so many platforms and channels for communication these days, there's an increased reputational risk associated with the provision of public services. So the template is designed to help in the event of a complaint or challenge that goes viral. There's also that statement of professional commitment to intellectual freedom. You can download that, and there's some slides as well to help you if you wanted to cascade this in training to your staff. So I just want to finish with this quote, which is from Nick Poole, who's the former CILIP CEO. It's taken from the guidance, and I think this just perfectly distills why this work is so important. It's important because a library should be a place of wonder and safety for children and adults. A place in which people can discover themselves and learn about the world around them. A place in which complex, sometimes conflicting ideas can be held up for scrutiny. A place of dialogue and respect, tolerance and inclusion. It should be a place in which cultures can meet and be reconciled. Thank you very much.
Supremely good timing. 5 minutes for questions. Does anybody have a question?
Thanks, Yvonne. David McMenemy from the University of Glasgow. As I've said before, it's a really important document and valuable, so thank you for producing it. One thing on public internet access, years ago I did a SLIC project, SLIC's here, aren't they, somewhere? Marian's here. Developing a model and acceptable use policy, which was then developed further by one of my PhD students into a nationwide one. So if you want a model AUP that's written to be readable and also based on best practice of all the 200 and odd authorities, then just go to my webpage and download the paper. It's completely free. Elaine did a great job on it. But I did have one question, sorry, which was around neutrality, because I know we're talking about it in July at the conference, but for me, one of the issues is that neutrality is an ongoing problem for us from a point of view of the critique of it, but also I think a lack of understanding across the profession about what it really means, which is that no one form of the good gets prominence. Now, I would acknowledge we have been slack about that, but equally we haven't replaced that important concept with anything else. And I think that's where a lot of the tensions are coming, because I think people don't feel empowered to make decisions because they've got different factions fighting over what should be in a library. So I don't know what your thoughts are, Yvonne, on that, what we could do is collectively to kind of think more deeply about what that solution should be, because at the moment it seems like a bit of a kind of pit fight.
I think it is, and all I can really say, absolutely so important, and I'm really glad that we're having the conversation at the CILIP conference. I think we do need to fill that gap. It's really important, and I think it's something that needs to happen quite urgently. So I think all I can really say is that we need to just do the work to try and fill that gap, because that is absolutely a big problem and a big challenge and tension here.
Hello. Again, thank you for that very comprehensive rundown. It was very helpful. My question is, because the legal aspects are changing so often and so frequently, at the access point for this paper, do you guys have an updating list of like more recent laws that have come into effect since this was published?
We don't, but we do intend to add that, because I think that's really important. I mean, I mentioned just 3 in September, and no doubt there's other regulations as well. I'm sure there's things that we've missed. So I think one thing we do want to do is to start to add that, yes, and also to add case studies too, as people start to use this guidance. We'd love to hear from you. We'd love to gather case studies and make that available as well. Because, you know, until this is put into practice and people start to use it, we hope it's helpful, we hope it is, but, you know, we want to hear from you and how you're using it and where there are difficulties and things. So we hope to build up a body of case studies, and absolutely, yes, try to keep abreast as best we can of changes in legislation, relevant case law, and yeah.
Thank you. Anyone else? We've possibly got time for one more question.
It wasn't a question actually, but it was more a response to the last questioner, and to say that actually, Yvonne, you talked repeatedly about the importance of involving legal services, council legal services, and I would say that actually that's the answer to your question. That if it's almost impossible to keep a document like this updated in terms of changes, but that's what legal departments are there to do. They're there to help you make sure that anything you do in terms of your policies are absolutely up to date legally.
Yes, that's absolutely right. Thank you.
Okay, it just remains to say thank you very much, Yvonne. Would everybody please join me in thanking Yvonne for that?